I want to, we're continuing on this series in Exile. This week, let's talk about crossing the line. Ooh, it's an ominous title. So last week we started with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We started with Daniel, the first chapter of Daniel, where these guys are all taken off into exile. And we said that, their situation and our situation isn't horribly different. We every day go into a world where our patterns of faith and life don't mean a lot. In fact, they're pretty foreign to a lot of the people that we talk to and we deal with. So we talked about finding a balance while serving God in this kind of exile scenario. The fact that, you and I, we go to work. We work with some people who accept our faith and a lot more people who really don't. And we have to make decisions about our faith and our purpose, what we want to hold on to, what we want to negotiate, what things are really, I need to hang on tightly and say, this is really, really important and this affects my faith, and what other things are not really that important. And a lot of times in church history, we've gotten those two things mixed up. We get really excited about some things that don't really make a whole lot of difference. I remember one of my first youth ministry jobs was at a church where it was kind of in a more depressed area of the city. And so we had a lot of students who would come to church. They'd come to youth group on Wednesday night, and then we would encourage them to come on Sunday morning. But the problem was that when they would come to church on Sunday morning, they didn't dress properly. In fact, for the most part, they wore hats. And heaven forbid, some of them wore hats backwards. It's just shocking to the culture for some reason. I don't know why. This is the mid-90s. I mean, it was not that long ago, or also a terrible long time ago. But it was a big deal, right? Because we had people in the church who said, well, these kids are coming in here and they're not respecting God's house, and they're not respecting the sanctuary, which is a word that we apply to the auditorium where we meet, because for some reason we took that Old Testament word and we put it into the buildings that we have, and we say this is now hallowed ground somehow. And yet, Jesus says if two of you are together, I'm there. That's hallowed ground, right? It's not a building, it's not a place. There's an Old Testament idea where there's the table and the showbread and the altar and the outer courts and the inner courts and the Holy of Holies and all these kinds of things where you can not get so close to God. But Hebrews says we just walk right into God's throne room through Christ, right? We are close to Him. And yet to a lot of folk, what mattered was that these guys were wearing their hats in the building, and they were wearing them backwards, which was definitely disrespectful. And somehow that stuff mattered a whole lot more than what else was actually happening. And it was hard to talk to people about that, because it was really hard to not say, here's this kid from a broken home. His parents aren't even around. I took him home last Wednesday night after youth group and had me drop him off at a crack house and said, hey, you don't want to come in because this is a drug house, so don't come on in here with me. I went in anyway. It was fun. It's a lot of very high people. And yet the only thing that anybody cared about was what they looked like or how they dressed. And I'm like, they're here around people who will love them and will teach them about Jesus, and I don't really care what they wear. But for some reason in church, we get that out of balance. We also talked about having to balance the act of submitting to an earthly authority that is set against God, while at the same time trusting God to sustain us. And this is, I had a conversation about this with a friend of mine who's in business as well. And he was saying, well, I'm not sure if I want to work at XYZ company because, of course, the guy who owns that company isn't a believer, and I'm not sure if everything that he does will fit with my morals and ethics. And I said, well, it's going to be hard to find a company where everybody in the company is a believer unless you work entirely in a Christian industry, and maybe Maybe that's what God leads you to do. I don't know. For me, I think it's more important to be out where there are people who don't know Jesus and have a relationship with him. But so I said, well, if you go by that criteria, it's going to be really, really hard to find anywhere that you ever want to work, because you might find a company that's pretty good, doesn't do anything unethical as far as the law goes, but maybe the boss is just extremely greedy, right? Maybe all he cares about is money, and he doesn't treat people very well. Well, I can't work there because, it's one of the 7 deadly sins, right? Greed. And I can't work somewhere else because of this or because of that or because of the other thing. I said, well, maybe the more important question is, how can I balance those two things? Am I in a position in my company where I can make the right choices? So I'm not forced to do anything that violates my faith, but at the same time, I'm able to be in this environment and in these relationships to be a positive influence. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit tonight. We talked about the fact that these 3 Hebrews are willing, in order to serve God, to be fully in the foreign culture, even as they try to figure out how to not be of it. Because there they are, being immersed in the language and the culture of the Babylonians, and they didn't say no to that. They said, fine, teach us. We'll learn your language, we'll learn your culture, but then there are certain things that we will do and that we won't do. And sometimes, when you're in that situation, when you're in Babylon and when you're having to negotiate those things, there are some things that go too far. There are some things that cross a line, and there are some things that we can't negotiate. And so sometimes the answer is just no. So in Daniel chapter 1, you see these young men, probably teenagers, early 20s, something like that, making all of these hard choices. And then in chapter 2, there's a bunch of dreams that are interpreted. There's a dream interpreted by Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel interprets it, and it's a big deal. It's really cool. Daniel chapter 3 is where things get really exciting, and it's the classic Bible story of Shadrach, Meshach, and into bed we go, Abednego. There's another version of that I won't say. They in the fiery furnace, right? And we've heard this story 1 billion times in church, and we talk about it because it's this great example of these guys being brave in this difficult situation. But in the context, as we've talked about it, you got to realize that this didn't happen day one. This happened a while into their time. This happened at least 3 years, because there was this 3-year program in chapter 1. So it's probably 3 to 5 years at least that they've been in exile and been in captivity. So this wasn't the first day. But it was a pretty obviously wrong thing. King Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 3, made an image of gold, 60 cubits high. I don't know what a cubit is, but it sounds big. 6 cubits wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Can you imagine? The guy just makes a giant image of gold and sets it out in the middle of this plain that everybody can see. He then summoned satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, all the provincial officials, so everybody who's in charge of anything, to come to the dedication of the image. So everyone came, and they assembled for the dedication of the image that he had set up, and they stood before it. Now, included in that group are these 3 guys we were talking about, and Daniel. And because they are rulers at this time, they are people who have been given authority, they're managing. And the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, all kinds of other things, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship immediately will be thrown into a blazing furnace. Pretty obvious choice. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound, they all bowed down. At this time, some astrologers, now you remember those guys from chapter 1, astrologers and magicians and all of those guys were the people that God gave Daniel and these 3 guys favor over. And for some reason, they were seen as being wiser and smarter than astrologers. And in fact, you'll find in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar talks a lot about how God has made Daniel wise in magic and all kinds of sorcery and that sort of thing. even though Daniel, never accepts that, that's how they're looked on. So the astrologers are obviously jealous of these guys, and they come forward and denounce the Jews. They say to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree, blah, 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 blah. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, who pay no attention to you. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." And it's important to remember, I think, that no matter how well we engage with culture, no matter how good a job that we do in integrating ourselves with our workplace or our neighborhood or whatever it happens to be, that we belong to a different kingdom. And there are times that we will hit lines that we cannot cross. Let's think of what a few of those lines might be. In this case, pretty obvious, worshiping idols. I would say worshiping idols, either Babylonian or American, that would be a bad thing. It's not as simple, right? We don't set up like a big gold idol now and worship it, but if we had an American set of idols, they would be things like money and success and power and maybe even politics sometimes. It could be sports, possibly. Soccer, mostly, not football. Abusing sexuality. Obviously, that's a line we can't cross. Violating marriage. Drunkenness. This is a fun one. Like, the Bible doesn't say don't drink, technically, but the Bible does say don't be drunk with wine. There's this idea of being always in self-control. And when we violate that and we are out of control of ourselves, it destroys our ability to ever talk to anybody about, the things that we want to talk about, like following Jesus and the difference he's made in our lives. It also opens us up to all kinds of destruction happening in our lives. And so having self-control at all times is really, really important. I wrote down loving money and using people instead of the other way around. Lying, cheating, stealing. A more subtle one, gossip and slander. This is a thing that's really easy to get into, especially if you work in an environment where there's a lot of talking happening around the office. And I found this week, I found myself a little bit further on that line than I wanted to be in saying something about somebody. And I had to stop in mid-sentence and go, you know what I'm saying there is not right. And I apologize for saying that to you. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to talk directly to that person. And there are a lot more. There are some times when it's really, really clear, and sometimes when it's really, really unclear. There are times when people sort of assume that you're with them, and so they kind of drag you into a situation that you had no idea you were going to be in. And sometimes it works out. And sometimes you get thrown in a fiery furnace. Sometimes you keep the job, and sometimes you get fired. And that part really isn't up to us. And the tough thing here is that it's not about, being legalistic. It's not about people with their hat on backwards, right? This other extreme over here. But it's also, there's this point at which in serving Jesus in our culture, we have to know where the line is and where we have to say, I'm out. And so Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego said, I'm out. And they were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar was very, very angry with them. And he said, haven't I told you that if you didn't worship it, that you'd be thrown into the furnace? I like what he says. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And they replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown in the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. What's interesting is they still call him your majesty. They're still deferential. They're still balancing this serving the immoral king and also serving God. And here they are in the middle of that situation, but they know that there's a line in there somewhere. And they're going to do the best they can to do everything they can up until that line. And then they're going to say, sorry, this is a line too far for us. And so, of course, you know the story. They get thrown into the furnace. The king gets very, very angry, and he throws them in. He has them bound. He has the furnace heated up 7 times more, and it was so hot it killed the soldiers who threw them into the furnace. That's how hot it was. And they fell into the furnace. And then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement, asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. And then he pulls them out, and it's this amazing story. The thing that we forget is when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are standing in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, they have absolutely no idea whether they're going to live or die. In fact, they say it in such a way that they say, God is able to do this. He's sure able to save us. But he might not. He might choose to let us die, and we're okay with that because we've chosen to serve God, and we've chosen this as the line, and we can't cross it, and whatever happens, happens. And that's how I felt in that situation I was telling you about. I knew that God was able to save me in that situation. I wasn't sure that he would. I wasn't sure what he was trying to do with my life, and I just said, I know I can't do this. Then the result of that is that, of course, Nebuchadnezzar is amazed, and he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon, and then he gives out this decree. This is my favorite decree that Nebuchadnezzar ever made. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. So here are these guys in exile and in a foreign land and under, essentially slavery, and they do this thing, and the result of it is that the wicked, ungodly person tells everyone that their God is better than all of the other gods. The result is that the true God is recognized and respected throughout the whole pagan kingdom. So, some table talk tonight. We'll talk about this. And then I have just a brief thought at the end here. So, what is the difference between legalism or a works-based religion and what the 3 Hebrews did? Were they just being legalistic, or were they being religious people? How do we balance those 2 things? We talked about that a lot tonight. Share an example of a time you had to make a decision like this. What was the result? Do you think you handled it right? Boy, sometimes, I have the right to only share my successes tonight, but I can think of a couple of times when I don't feel I handled it right in that same way, and it wasn't as clear to me when to say no. And I think I learned to have my own hotel room and go back to the hotel room at the right time by trial and error and bad experience. What types of things do you guard against falling into in your quest to be in but not of? What are the types of things that you are thinking about? And also you can add any other question you feel like. And discuss. Just one more thing before you all go home. What did I write down? The thing I've learned doing this is that you have to think about these choices before they happen, right? Because it does come on you really quickly. And if you haven't prepared, and if you haven't said, okay, these are the lines for me, these are the things I will be involved with and things I won't be involved with, you'll find yourself in this situation and you don't know where the line is. And it's important to know, to really evaluate where it comes from. Is this a line I'm drawing because, this is how God teaches me to live, or is this a line I'm drawing just because it's what I'm most comfortable with? And sometimes you end up in a situation where you're not entirely comfortable, but you can entirely be in control, right? And if you can be in control and if you can make the right decisions, but you're not entirely comfortable, you may be in Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego land where God has stuck you out where things are hard, but you can make good decisions, and then that gives God an opportunity to get glory in your life. So that's the important thing to remember, that you have to think about it in advance in order to make the best decisions. So let's pray. Lord, thanks for the chance to be together tonight. Thank you for the table and this group of people who are really thinking about how do I live my faith in everyday life, and how do I go beyond just religion and live my life with purpose and meaning, and know that every day you are putting me in situations with people who need to know you and who are in desperate need of someone to follow, to show them the right way, and help us to be those kind of people. Help us to be wise in the decisions that we make, and help us to follow the example of these three young men who are willing to put their life on the line and knew what the line was, and knew when they had to say no, and help us know when we have to say no. Help us know a long time before we get into the situation what's right, what's wrong, what to stay away from. In Jesus' name, amen.